Committee will come to order. The chair reminds the committee that we are on H.R. 908. The amendment and the bill is open for amendment at any point. I also want to announce that in consultation with my friend Mr. Waxman as to the votes on this bill today, the way that we are going to proceed is this. We're obviously now we're going to be considering amendments to the bill now. Any recorded votes on amendments will be rolled until this afternoon. It's our understanding that we're going to have a lengthy series of votes on the House floor to finish up the defense bill. That'll take us into this afternoon. And at the point that the DOD bill, authorization bill, is finished on the House floor is when we will then vote on the amendments ordered and hopefully at that point as well a final passage on the bill itself. And the point that we finish on H.R. 908, we will adjourn for the day. So we will not do the SIPSIA bill today because of the votes on the House floor. It's my understanding that we're going to be doing the DOD bill on the House floor, that an agreement has been reached on the Patriot Act extension. There'll be a rule vote and obviously debate on the bill itself, and it will be during that rule debate that we will then take up the amendments that are ordered on H.R. 908. So there will be no recorded votes in committee this morning. Those votes again will be rolled until this afternoon, and we will now entertain amendments for consideration of H.R. 908. And in keeping with the chair's announced policies, I'll first recognize the sponsors of any bipartisan amendments. Are there any bipartisan amendments to be offered at this point to H.R. 908? If not, we'll go to other. Mr.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Waxman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the title.
Mr. Waxman, is this the Amendment 12, the big substitute?
Yes.
Okay. Substitute. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 908 offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, we should all have the same goal, ensuring that the nation's chemical facilities are not turned against us by terrorists. It is well recognized that through theft or explosive device, chemical facilities, a critical part of our industrial infrastructure, could become weapons of mass destruction. The CFATS program was established in 2006 by an appropriations provision to address this risk. Unfortunately, the provision did not receive any scrutiny or input from this committee. The result was slapdash legislation that created dangerous loopholes, fails to protect whistleblowers and involved workers, fails to ensure that the effects of terrorist attacks are minimized through readily available technology, and keeps important information from those who need to know. The law required the Department to issue an interim final rule within 6 months of the law's passage. That hastily developed interim final rule is still in effect 2 years after it was meant to expire. H.R. 908 in its current form addresses none of these issues. It simply rubber stamps the work of the Appropriations Committee and says, good enough, for another 7 years. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is a substitute for H.R. 908. It would close the dangerous security gaps in the program and finally establish a comprehensive security program for chemical facilities. This amendment is based on H.R. 2868 from the last Congress. This amendment would ensure that many high-risk facilities that are currently exempted from the CFATS program would be covered by the program going forward. The program exempts facilities that are owned by the Department of Defense but operated by the private sector, DOE facilities, and in an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 high-risk chemical facilities, because some part of the facility is subject to regulation by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. My amendment would remove these exemptions because they make no sense. The threat posed by an insecure storage of a chemical can be the same whether the chemical is stored at a federal facility, a private facility, or another facility which is partially regulated by the NRC. I doubt very much whether a terrorist will try to assess which facility it is before they decide to attack it and use it against us. My amendment would strengthen security at covered facilities by requiring an assessment and, in particular circumstances, adoption of safer chemicals, processes, or technologies to reduce the consequences of a terrorist attack. This provision was developed in close consultation with the chemical industry to ensure that where cost-effective and feasible, safer approaches are implemented. My amendment would protect workers by ensuring that they have a role in the development of site security plans and by providing appeals and redress for employees adversely affected by background check errors. My amendment would also create an important mechanism for citizen petitions to ensure that the Department of Homeland Security faithfully executes the law. I should note that some provisions from H.R. 2868 have not been included in this amendment because they raise questions of germaneness. For instance, this amendment does not address the serious risk posed by chemical storage at drinking water facilities. It is of great concern that this risk goes unaddressed today, but I'll look forward for opportunities to address it going forward. The risks we face as a nation are real, and this committee must address them by improving this program and ensuring its implementation. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back his time. And gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Seek recognition in opposition to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this has many similar parts to what was moved, obviously, in the last Congress, which I voted against. And obviously, there's new challenges to this, especially in the new majority. First, this amendment authorizes $900 million for appropriation to DHS for the CFATS program. In fiscal year 2011, CFATS received around $90 million. The amendment authorizes $810 million more than the immediate preceding fiscal year, and the amendment makes no offsetting budgetary cuts or revenue enhancements. If this amendment passes, this bill probably would not be scheduled for the House floor and for consideration. Another major problem is the mandatory inherently safer technology debate. We had this tremendous debate over the last 3 years. This amendment requires all covered facilities to perform a formal IST assessment and actually, with some exceptions, make those changes if they are a Tier 1 or Tier 2 level facility. And we've continued to hear ambiguous testimony before our committee that IST is hard to quantify, harder to enforce, and expensive to do in the first place. Last thing we want to do is have inherently safer technologies drive our manufacturing facilities overseas where they're not going to have these standards. And it's all about keeping these production facilities safe through a CFATS program, but not so safe that they move them overseas, because obviously then we really don't have to worry about chemical manufacturing if they're not in our country. We just have to worry about the jobs that we've lost. I have genuine concerns about the cost of the IST assessments. Teams of people will conduct IST assessments with multiple degrees from multiple disciplines. Just these inspections and assessments are valued at a cost of $10,000 to $50,000 for a moderately sized holding tank. Employers have argued strongly that mandating IST now is the worst thing you could do to chill investment in security upgrades and set back the progress of the CFATS program. Another problem with this amendment is the issue of sharing protected information. This amendment makes serious modifications to loosen the way that sensitive information about a facility is protected from public disclosure. You know, and I've been a member for many, many years. And part of the concern is making sure those who need access to information have it. That's being done locally, but not providing open access so the terrorists know what's on site. In a DHS in a letter to Senator Levin in the last Congress asked that revisions be made to similar language because of its permissible treatment in judicial and administrative proceeding, inclusion of potential loopholes that would undermine the underlying purpose of CVI. And the last thing, this amendment creates many new regulatory requirements and deadlines. It even requires persons who submitted their security vulnerability assessment or site security plan early to resubmit all the paperwork again. Because of this going in an opposite direction of just strengthening and moving this CFATS program forward, I ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Chairman, I strike the requisite number of words and speak in favor of the Waxman Amendment. I want to express my support for the Waxman Amendment. This amendment represents a large portion of what was H.R. 2868, Continuing Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorist Security Act of 2010, that is germane to the current statute we're addressing today. When H.R. 2868 was originally introduced last Congress, I had several concerns with it, and that mostly were addressed in the final bill by working with both, at that time, Chairman Waxman and Subcommittee Chairman Ed Markey, and industry and labor officials. H.R. 2868 was not perfect when it passed the House, but it did pass on the suspension calendar last year. And it included substantial compromises on permanently extend chemical and water security regulations while reducing duplicative regulatory standards, increasing worker protections, and providing important safeguards to chemical facilities and water systems. That's why I'm supporting the Waxman Amendment today before the committee. While I didn't agree with everything in H.R. 2868, it was far superior to what we have today in H.R. 908. Most notably, it included a reconsideration process by which workers could petition DHS to make a determination as to whether the worker poses an actual terrorist security risk, as well as included annual reports to Congress assessing the much-needed background check and redress process data. We're unable to include that language in the background check language for the committee today because we cannot come to an agreement, and this, along with many other provisions, including in 2868, will not be included in H.R. 908. The current political reality and majority provisions of H.R. 2868 are not acceptable to the new House majority, making it impossible for the provision I outlined, or even something like H.R. 2868, if it was reintroduced, to pass the House. I know how important this legislation was and it's the stakeholders who worked on it last Congress, and I want to reiterate my support for the compromise legislation, even though there's no path forward this year to move the bill. But I do strongly support the Waxman Amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back my time.
Will gentleman yield to me before he yields back his time? I thank you for yielding back to me. I just want to respond to some of the statements made by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus. I think his view of the world is in the 19th century, not the 21st century. He appears to be, by his argument, afraid that if we ask industry to do anything to modernize and clean up and be more efficient, that they're going to pick up and leave. Well, the world is changing very quickly. And around the world, they're moving in the direction of being more efficient and more modern and cleaner. So if we stay with the idea that we can't make any changes, we will lose our industry because they won't be able to compete. And I just think it's a different way of looking at things, that we have to protect the status quo as if the world were not changing in any way, and we would be protected by holding on to that status quo. I wanted to give this point of view because I think it's an important one to recognize when we hear over and over again in the context of different issues that, oh, we couldn't ask that they do things that might be more conducive to a better environment. But in this, of course, in this bill, we're not just talking about the environment. We're talking about protecting our people from a terrorist attack. And if we can require at minimal cost facilities to do things that make them less vulnerable and make us less vulnerable to a terrorist attack, I think it's reasonable to do so, especially when you recognize that a terrorist is not going to say, well, this is a publicly run facility, this is a privately run facility, this one's regulated under CFATS, this is not regulated under CFATS. They're not going to choose their targets based on that. And we ought to harden the ability of all of our potential targets that could be used by terrorists to use the methods that I don't think will hurt them, and in fact, make in the short run and long run even help them be more competitive. I thank the gentleman for yielding to me.
Mr. Chairman, in the time I have left, I want to congratulate our ranking member because I served many years in the state legislature, and I had a very conservative Democrat from Bay City, Texas, who I accused him of running headlong into the 13th century. And to this day, he will come up to me and say, I still have my stone axe. But at least Congressman Shimkus is, 700 years later.
Not be bad then.
Yeah, not too bad.
Versus 1,300.
Anyway, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to seek time on the amendment? Gentlelady from California.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment. This substitute reflects months of bipartisan work and meetings with a range of stakeholders in the last Congress, and that has a lot of meaning to it. It's not just a bunch of words. Unlike the bill before us, it includes carefully crafted consensus solutions to many of the problems in the existing program, including information protection. I want to talk briefly about the information protection provisions in the substitute. This substitute identifies the types of information that must be protected and the procedures for safeguarding it. It gives the Secretary the authority to promulgate regulations and issue orders in order to prohibit the unauthorized disclosure of protected information. I think that's a very important part of this amendment. These provisions will ensure the appropriate sharing of protected information with federal, state, and local governments, law enforcement, and first responders, and designated chemical facility personnel. They would also create significant and clear penalties for inappropriate disclosure of protected information. Stakeholders supported these provisions in the last Congress, and I think they're exactly the type of consensus solutions that we should be working on to include in this legislation. I'm disappointed that the negotiations on this bill didn't result in the inclusion of this and similar provisions, but I hope that we can join together today to improve this program. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I thank Mr. Waxman for the work that he's done on this, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members wishing to seek time on the amendment? Mr. Markey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. During the opening statements yesterday, Ms. Bono Mack, who I do not see here, said she missed my singing, and she requested that I use that enormous God-given talent that I've been given in order to deal with some of these issues here today, and I really regret.
Is it true that you were in the Vienna Choir Boys recently?
Vienna Choir, the boys' choir, singing the Gregorian chant in Vienna. It's one of the most beautiful things. They charge you $50 to get in at the church, but I recommend to any of you who uses, well, it's the basis of the second collection at Catholic Church was always the key to the viability of the institution. So I do have a little song here in tribute to Ms. Bono Mack, if you can communicate that to her that I complied with her request. Don't know much about chemistry, don't know much toxicology, don't know what's ammonium nitrate, except it's easy to detonate. But I do know that IST was used to increase our security. What a much safer world this could be. Don't know much about gas chlorine, other than it makes your water clean. But it turns out that it can also kill, and it's included in this bill. But I know when companies convert, Their bottom lines do not have to hurt. What a much safer world this could be. So I would just like to point out that...
There's our American Idol candidate for next year, right there, folks.
You got a little tap dance with that as well? At least pray with the little thymballs on underneath.
I would like to point out...
Still doesn't have the votes, though.
That, I would like to reclaim my time. Is Simon here? No. Okay, we're done. I would like to point out that Congress has enacted legislation to upgrade security in sectors ranging from aviation to rail to nuclear power plants, but Congress has been unable to enact comprehensive chemical safety legislation. Instead, we have relied on an incomplete and inadequate legislative rider that was inserted into an appropriations bill in 2006 that amounted to little more than a long run-on sentence. That is why in the last Congress, I worked with Mr. Waxman and Benny Thompson and Jim Oberstar to craft legislation that addressed the weaknesses in current law. We spent the better part of a year meeting with the administration, with Republicans and industrial and environmental and labor stakeholders, and incorporated much of their input into our bill. Our final product, which was reported out of this committee, closed the loopholes in the Department of Homeland Security's existing authority by ensuring that drinking water, wastewater, and maritime facilities that contain dangerous chemicals would no longer be exempted from the regulations. We ensured that the Department and EPA would have the authority to require the use of cost-effective, safer chemicals or processes to reduce the consequences of a terrorist attack at the most dangerous facilities. We also included a number of important worker safety and whistleblower protections. Yet today, the Republicans have proposed to merely extend the expiration date for the existing inadequate law to 2018, leaving open all of those loopholes that the Democratic legislation closed. Mr. Waxman is making the proposal today that would close those loopholes so that we do not have inadequate, dangerous legislation that passes extending until 2018, those loopholes that can be exploited by al-Qaeda. We know that they are still targeting our country. We know that they are out there, and we know that we have a responsibility, given all of the information that we have just been able to garner from that raid in Pakistan, that they are alive, they are well, they have, in fact, plans to attack us. We should listen to those warnings and put these protections in place. I yield back to balance my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Louisiana.
I wish I could sing, but I wish Mr. Markey could too.
I do too. Stipulate to that.
But I admire the creativity. Well, we heard I was trying to understand the amendment, and obviously there's concern that there may be loopholes where CFATS governs and maybe also does the MITSA and where it does NRC. And I can reflect, I can appreciate that, except the testimony we had from Mr. Beers specifically said that they are working, I think has developed joint task force with the U.S. Coast Guard working group to come up and implement methods to harmonize CFATS and MITSA. I'm also told that the Department of Homeland Security has a similar memorandum of understanding working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to delineate what types of facilities are and are not covered, and also to develop a study regarding how chemicals currently are being secured at the facilities, regulated by NRC, risk-based tier, et cetera, et cetera. So there is an interagency effort to harmonize these efforts. We heard this in the testimony from Department of Homeland Security, and there was no challenge to that. People agreed with that. So on the one hand, I said, well, wait a second, we are already addressing this. Why do we have to put it in statute? Secondly, I have to say, let's assume that we're going to actually change how we do it. You know, only 4 out of 221 Tier 1 chemical facilities have gone entirely through the process, and none of the other tiers have. So only 4 out of 221 have successfully gone through the process, and yet now we're going to change the rules. I live in a place with lots of petrochemical plants and near a nuclear facility. And I'm thinking to myself, I want my community safe, and just when it seems like we're about to bring it to completion, we're going to change the rules. Frankly, that seems counterproductive. Lastly, I'll point out that it may come down, because I'm told really the effort to bring everything under Homeland Security is to make it easier to implement inherently safer technology. You'd have a central place, and Washington loves central control, so we'd have a central place where we could just force this regulation upon all the other agencies. And so let's consider inherently safer technology. When Mr. Beers was here from Department of Homeland Security, I asked him, Mr. Beers, do you really think that inherently safer technology may be akin to the Maginot Line? We are planning for the last war, but the offensive force is already thinking of the next. And he smiled. And he acknowledged that that could potentially be an issue. Now, I'm a physician. I'm always struck that by the time the FDA will approve a new indication for a medicine, in practice, it's already being done. Because by the time this bureaucracy finally gets around to doing everything it needs to do to finally approve, patients are benefiting tremendously. Are we going to say, wait a second, we have to use IST, we're going to force you to use IST, we're going to prescribe you from using anything else but IST, but we're going to put it in the same bureaucratic process that we know can be so dilatory and so counterproductive. Speaking of Al-Qaeda, clearly our security systems were behind the times on 9/11. Now, if we're specifically thinking about such a risk, why do we want to repeat the history? Why not learn from it? Why not have a dynamic, iterative process where Homeland Security, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Coast Guard work with the industries which they regulate to not have a library that you have to fit within the rule book that has been written, but an iterative process where we can say, wait a second, we just have intelligence that this is coming across. We haven't yet put it in a rule, but we think that you need to implement this. I think that would be more effective. I say that as a person who has a tremendous concentration, as does Mr. Green, of CFATS regulated facilities. I'm much more confident in that process than to think that we're going to build a Maginot Line, have the federal government implement it, and assume that we'll be safe behind it.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
43 seconds. Thank you. I want to thank you for addressing the timeliness issue. I also want to address you for raising the issue that of the perceived loopholes. There are no loopholes, as you understand, and as correspondents will continue to support, and raising the IST concerns, which is really the devastating impact that and makes a premise that these facilities aren't going to be doing stuff to modernize and do the chemicals they need to get the job done. And I'm sorry about trying to fight to save jobs, because that's what this is about for me. And I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I ask a unanimous consent the gentleman be given another 1 minute.
Gentleman, go ahead.
Thank you for yielding to me. I just want to point out that even if there's a memorandum of understanding, as you pointed out, it wouldn't be covered by this act. It wouldn't be enforceable. They'd have a memorandum of understanding, but under the law, Section 550 exempts facilities owned or operated by the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy or any facility subject to regulation by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So they could reach an agreement as to what would be a good way to resolve the matter, but then no one would be around to make sure that it's followed.
Reclaiming my time, my understanding is that only chemical facilities owned and operated by DOE are exempt. Simply being regulated by DOE is not grounds for exemption, and that Homeland Security and DOE are sharing this information routinely regarding CFATS implementation at facilities that would otherwise be exempt. So there does seem to be an iterative process even between agencies that is accomplishing the goal.
Yeah, I disagree with the gentleman's interpretation. Thank you.
I yield back.
His time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? If not, the vote will occur on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. Roll call is requested, and do the pre-announced discussion between Mr. Waxman and myself. The vote will be rolled until this afternoon. Are there other members wishing to offer an amendment to the bill? Mr. Shimkus.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr.
Clerk,
Chairman. It's Shimkus 08.
Clerk will report the title.
An amendment offered by Mr. Shimkus of Illinois.
And the amendment will be considered as read, and the staff will circulate the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment addresses a concern that was first raised by our colleague, Mr. Green, at our subcommittee hearing on H.R. 908. The Department of Homeland Security has various regulations and programs, each of which requires that chemical facility employees pass background checks and carry ID cards to prove it. It gets ridiculous and expensive when some employees are required to carry more than one ID card and to undergo more than one check just because the facility they work in fits into more than one category. For example, employees in a chemical plant located on the Houston Ship Channel are required to carry the famous TWIC card, which is issued by the Coast Guard under the Marine Transportation Security Act, and also a separate card that is required under the CFATS program. There are other cards as well. Can you imagine if we required interstate truck drivers to carry a driver's license for every state they drive through? At first, when we heard about streamlining the requirement, we thought it would mean trading in your various state licenses and getting a single federal license to replace them. It turns out that this bill is even simpler. It says your Texas license is good in Illinois. So if an employee wants to bid on a better job in another factory or even in a different area of the same factory, he doesn't need a new DHS background check or a new ID card. He won't lose out in the job bid merely because of the cost and delay of clearing another background check. We've been told that some workers even have to pay for these background checks out of their own pockets. Sadly, it was to avoid this kind of bureaucratic redundancy that we created the Department of Homeland Security to begin with. Its job was to ensure coordination among the various security agencies to make systems more efficient and to ensure that the cost and burden of anti-terrorism measures did not get out of hand. So here we are, 9 years later, using a statute to give DHS the streamlining that we thought we gave them back in 2002. While this amendment does not contain the exact wording that any of us preferred, I think it provides a good break to both workers and employers, and I urge its adoption. And gentlemen,
Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment, but I'd like to take a moment to discuss the committee process. I'm pleased that we're able to work out this amendment. It's an example of a small implementation issue that, if enacted, would make the law more workable. It will make DHS less bureaucratic while easing the burden on workers and industry alike. By recognizing the value of TWIC cards for those who already have them, this amendment will prevent unnecessary and burdensome background checks. This is a provision that was championed by Representative Green and supported by all the stakeholders in the last Congress, and I'm happy to see it included here. But it does not address the significant security gaps or many other issues in the underlying statute that need to be addressed. That's why the workers who are on the front lines at these facilities remain opposed to H.R. 908, even with the adoption of this amendment. In the days following our legislative hearing on this bill, Mr. Green and I approached our Republican colleagues with proposals for a number of provisions to address the deficiencies of the CFATS program. And I'm disappointed that the majority refused to work on these other issues. Many have consensus solutions that would make our nation better off. The committee's failure to adopt solutions to these problems does not reflect well on us. This amendment does not protect people living around high-risk drinking water facilities or port facilities or NRC facilities. It does not protect whistleblowers or ensure worker participation in the development of site security plans. It does not provide tools for enforcement to strengthen a program that 4 years in has failed to produce a single approved site security plan. Not a single plant has completed the process set up by the statute, but this bill will do nothing to improve implementation. The list of deficiencies goes on. I support this amendment. I welcome this change to the bill, but I am disappointed that this small step is all we could achieve. While this amendment is not enough to make me urge my colleagues to support this bill, I do urge them to support this amendment. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the fact that there is an effort here of finding a consensus on this amendment. But I think this amendment and this discussion brings up a really important issue when it talks about the security of these facilities. And too often, committee separation of jurisdiction stops or restricts us from doing what we ought to be doing, is talking about how issues like the Homeland Security Committee and the department, especially the National Department, abandoning certain requirements that were set up by the 9/11 Commission does affect not just Homeland Security in the purest sense, but all the security of the people in the United States. And I get into it as the gentleman, the author, was talking about this repetitive identification issue being a problem, when at the same time we're talking, this committee has not even considered or would consider bringing up the fact that Department of Homeland Security has abandoned the implementation of the Real ID bill, which was one that set up federal standards for state IDs so that we didn't have to have somebody carry a separate 50 different documents every time they cross the state boundary. And so what we've got now is that we've got an opportunity to point out that the 9/11 Commission said it was essential that we set up national standards for state IDs, so we didn't need to have a federal ID in everybody's pocket. The minimum standard by the federal government for an ID should be a standard across this country that all of us can agree on. And believe me, both sides of the aisle would address this issue if we were talking about mandating it on business. But because we're talking about government needing to do the right thing, we always find an excuse to say, we'll worry about that later. And I think that this amendment is a step in the right direction. But I just want to make sure that we point out that while we do this, this is only talking about a segment of the population that has access across this country to certain activities that could hurt and endanger the American people. Remind you that it was not a private sector that gave the identifications to the 9/11 terrorists that they could use to get on the airplanes to kill 2,000 Americans. It was a government agency. That government agency made a mistake. And we still have the possibility of that kind of mistake going on now. And so as we go back and forth, the Republican side doesn't like to mandate on local and states certain minimum standards. The other side of the aisle doesn't like to mandate anything on government but concentrate on the private sector. And I hope that maybe we can get together and say one of the gaping holes of this issue is not what we're not making the businesses doing, but those of us in government are not doing to address that. And that means not only state and locals doing the right thing, but the Department of Homeland Security not retreating from a top priority by the American people and by the 9/11 Commission, and that is to have secure documentation for everybody so that you avoid those things in 9/11. And I just think that as we go through this and discuss this amendment, we've got to remember that we're only addressing a small segment while this committee has looked the other way, while the Department of Homeland Security has abandoned a major strategy that was really mandated and encouraged by the 9/11 Commission. And maybe because it's 10 years later, we've forgotten how that tragedy occurred. And it wasn't so much the fact that the private inspectors that we've replaced with government people at the airports were shown IDs that were given by a government agency, and we still have not implemented that, avoided that problem. So as we talk about national security, how it's important that we get the private sector to do the right thing, one of both sides agree that we have not required either federal government, state governments, or local governments to do their fair share at securing the neighborhoods and the communities of this country. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I strike the last word. When I agreed to co-sponsor this legislation, I asked Chairman Shivkus if we could work to bring a resolution to the duplicative issue of background checks in the CFATS program. Ms. Shimkus and Chairman Upton staff had worked diligently with my staff to come up with a resolution on the specific text on this issue. Employees that have already passed background checks should not have to be required to undergo additional burdensome background checks under CFATS, and their current personnel surety requirements should be deemed sufficient, particularly since employees with secure access at these facilities must also receive a TWIC card, a transport worker identification card. When the TWIC card was rolled out in our district, and I have the biggest petrochemical complex in the country along with the largest foreign tonnage port, they estimated there'd be about 60,000 TWIC cards issued in the Port of Houston. Right now, there are over 260,000 TWIC cards issued into the Port of Houston because of the number of people who have to go on the waterside chemical plants, refineries, docks, you name it. And we had some problem with trying to get through the bureaucratic process. And we worked through that process in our district offices and helped numerous individuals. What I would like to do is keep from having the heartache of those folks. Some of them worked at one refinery for 30 years and had a problem in his background, but it wasn't enough not to get him a TWIC card, but on first sight it was. So not only that, but the TWIC card process cost an individual $130, and the costly process of this background check and surety certification sufficient for workers at the Port of Houston. It should be more than valid under CFATS. Again, a lot of employers would cover that $130, but I know a lot of them didn't. So they actually worked with payment plans for their employees to do it. This amendment ensures that workers who already have a TWIC card would not be subject to additional background checks to meet CFATS requirements. Additionally, the amendment directs the Secretary to determine if alternative background checks are sufficient to meet the risk-based performance standards requirements under CFATS. This will enable DHS to promulgate regulations saying that TWIC credentials and possibly other credentials can be used to satisfy CFAT requirements. Therefore, a CFATS facility who wanted to accept a TWIC card and not do anything else could potentially do so. I also believe the amendment is especially important for chemical facilities that have parse facilities. One facility regulated under MTSA and a separate facility regulated under CFATS. The chemical facility should be able to transfer workers from their marine facility to their CFATS facility without performing additional background checks and security requirements. The workers' current personal security requirements, such as a TWIC, should be deemed sufficient. I know Homeland Security testified before the committee and stated they're keenly aware of the duplicate nature of the background checks in different facilities, especially those regulated under MITSA and CFATS. This amendment will provide DHS with the guidance and ensure they continue to find ways to avoid the duplicate, unnecessary background checks. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? If not, the vote is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other members wishing to offer an amendment to the bill? Mr. Markey, which amendment? One?
Number one.
Clerk will report the title.
An amendment offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
And the amendment will be considered as read. Staff will circulate the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized in support of his amendment for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I've had 2 incidents with Al-Qaeda in my district that are quite significant. One, Abdul Maskini. He came through. He was one of the Millennium Bombers. He came in an LNG tanker into Everett, Massachusetts, which is about 16, 18 blocks from my house. And he was one of the key plotters in the Millennium bombing. And then Muhammad Atta and the other 9 who hijacked the 2 planes from Logan Airport were cruising throughout my district for about a year before they ultimately perpetrated that heinous crime against our country. So, and many, many, many people from my congressional district were on those 2 planes that were hijacked. So I take this subject very seriously, and I think it's important for us to ensure that we have done everything that we can to guarantee that there is no repetition of those events. For chemical facilities, the risks are clear. There are many facilities in this country whose toxic chemicals could endanger millions of people in the event of a terrorist attack or catastrophic accident. Just last year, we learned that the Lashkar terrorist organization that committed the 2008 attacks in Mumbai asked one of its operatives to conduct surveillance of an unnamed chemical plant in Maryland. Chemical security is more than just guards and guns and gates, because it is often possible to dramatically reduce the consequences of a terrorist attack and remove the need for guards and guns and gates altogether. The December 3rd, 1984 accident at a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, now owned by Dow, released 42 tons of toxic mic gas, killing thousands of people and injuring many more. Safer substitutes existed even at that time, but they were not used. Several years ago, a chemical tank exploded at a Bayer facility in West Virginia, sending a fireball into the sky and killing 2 employees. That facility, just like the Dow facility in Bhopal, also stored large quantities of toxic mic gas. And just like the Dow facility in Bhopal, Bayer knew it could easily have used safer processes that eliminated or greatly reduced the need for the toxic chemicals in the first place. The West Virginia accident could have been much, much worse, and it shouldn't have taken that accident for Bayer to agree to implement safer processes. For 7 years, I have been working to ensure that the riskiest facilities that are able to cost-effectively reduce or eliminate the vast quantities of toxic chemicals from their sites would do so. Terrorists cannot blow up what is no longer there. Now, the Republicans have already rejected Mr. Waxman's excellent amendment to include the inherently safer technology provisions we worked out with the American Chemistry Council staff last year. This amendment seeks to remedy one of the glaring problems with the Department's current authority. The law actually prevents the Department of Homeland Security, prevents them from disapproving a chemical company's site security plan based on the presence or absence of a particular security measure. What this means is that even if there was an egregious security problem, like a hole in the fence surrounding the toxic chemicals, the Department of Homeland Security is not allowed to disapprove the company's security plan just because of that. And if a company completely ignores the availability of cost-effective and less dangerous chemicals or processes, the Department cannot require those either. My amendment solves this problem by using the language first suggested by Dow Chemical Company when it attempted to negotiate a legislative compromise on the use of inherently safer technology with Greenpeace 2 years ago. The very same language that was then submitted with their approval to this committee by the American Chemistry Council as part of our negotiations with them. All my language does is untie the Department of Homeland Security's hands and allows it to disapprove a site security plan on the basis of the presence or absence of a particular security measure, only if no other security measure can satisfy the chemical security standards or address the vulnerabilities at the plant. It seems to me that my amendment to empower the Department of Homeland Security and allow it to order specific security measures to correct specific security vulnerabilities is the least this committee can do in order to make sure that we don't tie the hands of the Homeland Security Department. And I urge support for my amendment.
Members wishing to speak? Mr. Shimkus.
Speak in opposition to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Receiving this amendment at 7:30 for all the years of being diligently working on this, obviously this is the first time I've heard about this amendment or had a chance to do additional research. Trying to summarize it, we're in an attempt trying to change what we have in here to a risk-based standard to an undefined applicable risk-based standard. This amendment changes existing provisions of law from prohibiting DHS from rejecting a site security plan based upon the presence or absence of a specific security measure proposed to be implemented at a facility. 2, 1, conditioning the rejection on whether the security measures or any other ideas the plant owner has can satisfy CFAT's risk-based performance standards regulations, or allowing DHS to reject the site security plan if it does not adequately address the vulnerabilities outlined in a facility's vulnerability assessment. This amendment is unnecessary and duplicates existing CFAT's regulations. Title VI, Part 27.245 of the Code of Federal Regulations outlines a criteria and process by which DHS can reject a site security plan. Specifically, this states that DHS may disapprove a site security plan that fails to satisfy the risk-based performance criteria in Title VI of the Code of Federal Regulations. Moreover, it requires each submitted site security plan to address each vulnerability identified in the facility security vulnerability assessment and identify and describe the security measures to address each such vulnerability. In addition, the amendment strikes language, as I said in my opening, of trying to regulate definitions of what a quote-unquote risk-based performance standard to requirement on the facility owner-operator of a facility to meet an undefined applicable risk-based standard. With that, the intent is to continue to move, working with DHS, make sure our chemical security plants are safe and secure. And both sides need certainty. This creates another level of uncertainty and challenges. I ask my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Waxman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I support this amendment. According to the Department of Homeland Security, security risk is a function of the consequences of a successful attack on a facility, the vulnerability of that facility to attack, and the intent of a potential adversary. If we want to lower overall risk, we must lower each of these variables, including consequences. The best way to do this is to use safer chemicals or processes that would reduce the consequences in the event of a terrorist attack and would make the facility a less desirable target in the first place. Many chemical facilities are doing this already voluntarily, and they're improving the efficiency, safety, and security of their operations. But our national security cannot depend on voluntary efforts by the best actors. Under the existing statute, the Secretary cannot require the use of safer chemicals or processes, even if they are the only way to ensure that a facility meets the risk-based performance standards. That prohibition is a glaring weakness in this statute. When that proviso was drafted by the appropriators, the fear of process changes was allowed to override security concerns. This amendment corrects that weakness by allowing the Secretary to require the use of safer chemicals or processes where no other security measure can ensure that the standards are met. It strikes a balance between our security needs and the needs of regulated facilities and ensures that no changes will be required unless absolutely necessary. I think this amendment makes a great deal of sense, and I'd like to yield to Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentleman very much. First of all, we submitted this amendment 2 weeks ago when the markup for this bill was originally scheduled. So you've had the amendment for 2 weeks. We sent it over there when you first scheduled it. Secondly, Al-Qaeda has already warned us. They're telling us the top of their terrorist target list are nuclear power plants, chemical facilities, and subways. You know, we know this. So we shouldn't be tying the hands of the Department of Homeland Security to be able to put security around the facilities that we know that they want to attack. And I understand that the chemical industry, I understand that the nuclear industry doesn't want to be, bothered by the Department of Homeland Security coming in and finding specific problems and demanding that they have to correct them because the Department of Homeland Security, in all of their expertise, and they're dedicated their lives to doing this, are saying that this could be a huge risk that al-Qaeda could exploit. So I just think that having this be so ambiguous, not giving them the authority to be able to close down these apertures through which al-Qaeda can come, and they arrested another coven of al-Qaeda in my district in Watertown just last year, I'm very concerned. I'm very, very concerned. And they're smart, they're well educated, they have specific targets, we know what they are. We shouldn't be we should not be tying the hands of the police. We should tell the police, do what you have to do to protect us. And I just don't think that the chemical industry is serving our country well in objecting to this kind of protection. I yield back to the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The chairman yields back his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana. For what purpose? Gentleman's recognized. Last word. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. I don't know this, and so I'm asking this out of kind of a desire to know. I'm assuming that if Department of Homeland Security goes to a plant, you mentioned Dow. Dow has a major facility in my district, but let's pick another because it may be under the Coast Guard part of it. And they do a site security plan and they see that it's inadequate. Current law is that they may disapprove. Okay, so they disapprove. But I can also imagine that in this complex place, there's 100 things on the checklist. Most important, number one. Least important, 100. They get 99 out of 100. The 100th, they have a commitment that they're going to fix, and so then they give maybe a provisional approval. And that's actually an efficient process. Again, only 4 out of 220 Tier 1s have been approved, so I can accept that there would be some desire for efficiency. Does that, not having confronted that, but imagining that, does the author of the amendment feel like that would not be allowed under his amendment, or that it's inappropriate to be allowed, or that this sort of iterative process is inadequate? I'm asking.
Yeah, thank you. I thank the gentleman for the question. Yes, the key language is the presence or absence of a particular security measure. So if the Homeland Security police say this is a vulnerability, it's an individual vulnerability, but it's important, very important, and we want to correct it before we approve it.
Now, let me ask you, because you added very important. I can imagine that when Homeland Security, because I'm very impressed when they come and testify, that they would go through and they would say, you know, here's some that are very important. We ain't going to approve you unless you get this fixed. And here's one that really is best practices. We want you to do it, but we're going to give you an approval. Sure, it's important. It wouldn't be on the list, but remove very. Under the members' amendment, would that sort of iterative, cooperative process be allowed? Again, I just want to get these things approved, Tier 1, appropriately, but only 4 out of 220 have been. Will this slow down that process?
Yeah, the department, in my opinion, should have the ability to be able to say, as the police in a community trying to protect the community, you know, that they have found something that has not been remedied that is a problem.
Now, let me ask you, once my wife was speeding, the cop stopped her. She jumped out, and she was, I'm a gastroenterologist. Let's just say she was having a gastroenterology problem, and she had to get home quickly. The cop let her go. Now, that actually gave the cop the discretion to prevent a very embarrassing situation. I hope my wife's not watching. My question is,
no one is watching. Okay? Don't worry about it.
After your song, they may be.
This is such a ghetto life. This is such a ghetto life thing here.
So, but my question is, there was an appropriate use of judgment that allowed, you know, a warning, but allowed something to take place. Is this not? I don't know. And when the Department of Homeland Security, which I don't see as being soft on this issue, has the flexibility of may, do we add something by saying shall? Now, Mr. Waxman suggested it might be inherently safer technology that the bill is really after. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think that the issue really comes down to denying the Department of Homeland Security the ability to be able to order a specific change.
No, because right now they may. Just reclaiming my time, they may.
The way I view it is, I basically believe that that police officer exercised good judgment, and I believe the Department of Homeland Security will exercise good judgment. Okay?
So, but it seems like the may allows.
And I would rather err on the side of giving the Department of Homeland Security the ability to order.
But they have that now. But is this really about? Mr. Waxman suggested it's actually about IST. So is it actually about IST, or is it about forcing them to close to not approve a plan, even if it's only a minor problem? And again, I'm asking this because I want to know the intent of the legislation, not because I'm trying to challenge.
No, we're not giving them the authority to disapprove a plan, no matter what. We have a may in the language, not a shall. On line 5, it says may disapprove, not shall. So it's discretionary, and on that basis, I would give them that.
But they may disapprove now. I'm out of time, but
they may.
But I would like to, at some later point, if we could address if this is actually about IST, because the legislation doesn't say that, but Mr. Waxman's comments suggest that it is.
Gentleman's time's expired.
I yield back.
Anyone seek recognition on the amendment? If not, the vote will occur on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion and the chair, the noes have it.
I have a roll call, Mr. Chairman.
As stated in the agreement, we'll roll this vote until after the vote's on the floor. I'd now like to call up the next amendment, the Shimkus Amendment number 10.
Amendment to the committee print for H.R. 908, offered by Mr. Shimkus.
And I recognize myself 5 minutes in support of the amendment. When the Undersecretary of Homeland Security testified on H.R. 908 just a month ago, he said that he would prefer to make the program permanent. That means no sunset at all. I in essence, agree with him. But reauthorization is always an important thing to look at provisions. And the witnesses who represented a wide variety of plan owners and operators agreed, extend the authority for as long as possible. We need the longest possible extension for 3 reasons. First, the program has barely gotten launched. Many facilities are still crafting their site security plans, and the department is still refining its review and inspection processes. This will take more than a few years to get going. The last thing we need is to interrupt the programs by going back to square one and starting over. The second issue is that compliance with CFATS takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money. One trade group estimated $8 billion just for themselves. A shorter sunset date triggers uncertainty for business. Much investment is in long-term capital that may be amortized over many years. Accountants and investors get nervous when a cost appears to spread over more years than the law requires it for compliance and investor planning. If the program expires, what will replace it? Something even more costly? To reduce these risks for the people who are carrying the cost burden of the compliance, we need to extend the authority as long as we can. Under current House practice, that is 7 years. On the third issue is let's remember the program's purpose, securing us against terrorists. Why risk interrupting that effort any sooner than we have to? And with that, I yield back my time. Anyone else would like to speak on the amendment? The chair recognizes Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. This bill extends a flawed program with almost no substantive changes. Section 550, which established the CFATS program, was meant to expire in 2009, and was never meant to be a comprehensive or long-term approach to our national security. 4.5 years after Section 550 was passed, we have still failed to address this issue in a comprehensive way. We tried last Congress. This committee worked diligently with the Homeland Security Committee and the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to pass comprehensive legislation that passed the House of Representatives. That legislation would have addressed the significant security gaps in Section 550, protected workers and whistleblowers, provided enforcement, and moved us towards safer chemicals and processes to reduce the consequences of potential terrorist attacks. This bill does none of those things. The primary thing this bill does is to encourage Congress not to revisit this important issue for years. Extending through 2017 is unwise. Extending through 2018, even more so. The interests at stake are too great. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. And I will I'd like to say further that the way we should look at this issue is this program was authorized in an appropriations bill. It didn't come through our committee. It was expected it would be in place for a short while, and then our committee, Homeland Security, the Infrastructure Transportation Committee, would develop a more comprehensive approach. And I think that I could see that thinking. But now to say that what they did was good enough and we're going to extend it all the way to 2018 is pushing the can down the road, kicking the rock to the side, not facing the decisions we need to make. What other?
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes.
And as I said in the statement of this, our concern is since there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of these facilities haven't been inspected, that to change the rules when folks are going, that's our focus on why we would want longer. And I would just thank you for yielding.
Well, I respect that position, but I disagree with it. I think that when we have deadlines, we're forced to make decisions. Sometimes we're not being forced to make a decision on this bill this time, but I think it's too long a deadline, and I wanted to express that view and therefore oppose the gentleman's amendment. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? The gentleman from Texas rise.
Mr. Chairman, I have a secondary amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Green.
Gentleman is recognized in 5 minutes as we distribute the secondary amendment in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I agreed to co-sponsor the legislation, I asked Chairman Shimkus if we could limit the authorization to a 5-year authorization. FY11 CR recently signed into law authorized the current CFATS appropriations until the end of the fiscal year. That ensures the program is funded for 1 year. Pushing out the authorization 2018 gives the program 1 additional year without Congress having to revisit the program. The majority has cited jurisdictional issues with Homeland Security Committee as justification for pushing the authorization date to 2018. This has taken precedent over more moderate authorization length. I also want to maintain energy commerce jurisdiction of CFATS, but I have reservation about authorizing this program for 8 years instead of 7 or even 5, which I originally requested. I agree with the majority that a year-to-year authorization, which can be held up by political budget debate, does not offer safety assurances or assurance to the industry that their investment in safety are a wise investment. H.R. 908 does offer some continuity system, but 8 years, which is essentially what this bill does with the additional year provided by the CR, is too long for Congress to go without revisiting the program. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment that would limit the extension of this program to 5 years. The 5-year extension provided by my amendment would give this committee the time we need to evaluate any potential successes or flaws in the program and still provide industry the assurances they need to make prudent investments in the safety of their facilities. And, Mr. Chairman, unless there are questions, I will yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back time. Now I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. Let me first state that my colleague has been a great ally and a great opponent in this same bill. As we walk through this process, I agree with the Undersecretary of Homeland Security that we ought to have a permanent bill. So if I were to agree with him, we would make it permanent, but because of the way we work and have, in essence, 7 years is as far as we usually go out. You know, my perspective, I came back from the permanency to 7. You, again, have been very diligent in expressing your opinion on where you want to be and have that, and I appreciate the struggle we've had to maintain, but because of wanting to, for the reasons I had talked to and shared with Chairman Waxman in our little commentary, it's important for there to be some certainty, and the longer certainty time out there, especially with the huge capital investments that can come on, and actuary planning and being able to borrow money to meet these changes, I'd like to stick to the time as the amendment. So with that, I would ask my colleagues to reject the secondary amendment. Does anyone else like to speak? The chair recognizes Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to support this amendment. I thank Mr. Green for offering it to limit the extension of this program. It's an important program, but it's an insufficient program in the form in which it is at the present time. And therefore, I would want to limit the authorization period further, but that's why this amendment is a step in the right direction. Industry says that a multi-year extension is necessary to encourage investment in security and development of technology. In the last Congress, we responded to that need by passing comprehensive legislation to establish a strong, effective, and long-term chemical security program. That bill, like the substitute I offered today, would have closed critical security gaps in the existing program, strengthened security requirements, protected workers, and increased enforcement. A long authorization period gives the American people the false impression that we've done our job and do not need to revisit this issue for years to come. But we haven't done our job. H.R. 908 doesn't address the critical problems with this program. Security of water facilities is not addressed. Security at federally owned, contractor-operated facilities is not addressed. The use of safer chemicals or processes cannot be required, even if they are the only way to secure a facility. Workers and whistleblowers are not protected, and enforcement tools are still lacking. We must work to address these shortcomings to ensure that our national security. I therefore urge my colleagues to support this amendment and limit the extension of this program. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone seeking time on the amendment? If not, the chair will call a vote on the secondary amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, we need a roll call vote.
Okay.
Request a roll call vote.
And I need clarification because of the agreement. So the roll call vote will be conducted after the floor votes.
Correct.
And if that fails, then there will be a roll call vote on the primary First Amendment. Okay. If it's requested. At the time then. Very good. And so the gentleman's rights will be preserved. Anyone else seeking? The chair recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Butterfield from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Would the gentleman suspend for a minute?
Well, we can't until we see that.
Yeah, because we don't know the disposition. I apologize to my colleague. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on this amendment.
The point of order is reserved.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Let the clerk report the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print for H.R. 908 offered by Mr. Butterfield.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. While the clerks are passing out the amendment, I'll go ahead and try to explain it very briefly to my colleagues. This amendment is a whistleblower amendment. The amendment would protect whistleblowers from retaliation if they report security problems at chemical facilities. Specifically, Mr. Chairman, whistleblowers are protected under this amendment when they report an alleged violation to the Department of Homeland Security or when they refuse to perform duties that they believe violate the law or when they testify before Congress or in another official proceeding. Information about security flaws or violations of CFAT's requirements will be essential to the success of this program and our national security. Providing protection to whistleblowers will ensure that people with essential information are able to share it with Congress and regulators without fear of retaliation. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, is nearly identical to the whistleblower provisions we have included in practically all of our laws over time, such as the Clean Air Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Toxic Substances Control Act and the Solid Waste Disposal Act and Superfund and Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the list goes on and on. Whistleblowers concerned about chemical plant security deserve the same protections as employees under any of these other laws. This amendment will make chemical plants safer by allowing employees to alert the Secretary to urgent problems. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment. Thank you for listening. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Pennsylvania insist on his point of order?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I insist on point of order. The amendment violates Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the Rules of the House because it's not germane to the underlying bill, so the amendment is not within the committee's jurisdiction.
Mr. Chairman,
Would anyone, gentleman from California, Mr. West?
I'd like to be heard on this issue. I understand
Gentleman is recognized.
That the amendment offered by Mr. Butterfield may provide the basis for the Education and Workforce Committee to claim a jurisdictional interest. But our committee also has a jurisdictional claim to these provisions, as they would be an integral component of a program squarely within the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Given the importance of ensuring appropriate protections for whistleblowers, I urge that the committee refrain today from pursuing procedural objections and incorporate this language into the text the committee reports. After we report the legislation from the committee, there could be consultation with the Committee on Education and the Workforce as the bill moves to the floor. But such consultation is routine. It's what we do with many bills in every Congress. If we want to protect whistleblowers and make our facilities safer, we can adopt the amendment. If we want to support whistleblowers, we can adopt the amendment. And I want to point out that there are many laws that already have whistleblower protections, including the 38, list of 38 of those 8 were reported out of our committee that had whistleblower protections. So while the gentleman has what appears to be a legitimate point of order, if it were the committee's will not to assert the germaneness objection, I think we could go forward with this amendment and then consult with the Education and Workforce Committee and then perhaps reach an agreement with them without having the whole bill held up by them.
Would the gentleman yield for a minute?
Certainly.
I think the counter argument could also be made that if we think we have a possibility of going through the germaneness issue, we could ask the gentleman to withdraw the amendment, and as the process moves forward to the floor in consultation with the Committee of Jurisdiction, maybe through the rules process there'll be something in line with that.
Well, reclaiming my time, I appreciate what you're saying. If you're not going to allow the amendment to go forward here, then that will be the decision. But I hope what the chairman is also saying that if that's the case, we will continue to look at this issue and see if we can get an agreed upon whistleblower protection that we can negotiate with the Education and Workforce Committee. Is the chairman willing to agree to that?
The ranking member knows that I'm always open to in discussions on policy and assistance, and we do want to talk with the Committee of Jurisdiction. We're always willing to talk.
The other committee with jurisdiction.
Well, we want to make sure that they're in line with our as we move forward. So,
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
I will.
I would find it interesting, though, that we have jurisdiction over chemical security, and yet we don't have jurisdiction over what we can do with that. I think, as most of us who serve on this committee and proud to be here, would love to expand our jurisdiction, and so maybe if we push the envelope that we ought to have jurisdiction over it, and maybe have Ed and Workforce to contact us after we do it. But with that, I thank you for yielding.
Anyone else seeking time on this? Then the chair will now rule on the point of order. Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the Rules of the House prohibits the committee from considering non-germane amendments. The precedents of the House set forth several general tests for germaneness. These include the jurisdiction test. Having reviewed the amendment, consulted with the House parliamentarian, chair finds jurisdiction over this type of whistleblower protection rests with the Committee of the Education and Workforce because the amendment introduces matter outside the jurisdiction of the committee. The amendment is non-germane.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina.
Are you declaring that jurisdiction is exclusively in the Education and Workforce, or that we share the jurisdiction with that committee?
The chair is not a parliamentarian. I will not issue an advisory opinion. You can check with the parliamentarian for that.
To interpret what you just ruled just a moment ago, and certainly I will accept your ruling, but one could infer from your statement that we are ceding a jurisdiction on this type of issue.
I would inform the gentleman that we have consulted with the House parliamentarian on this amendment and the germaneness aspect of it.
Would the gentleman from North Carolina yield to me?
I will yield to the ranking member.
I think the chairman's ruling is correct, as I understand the parliamentary situation, but it should, I would hope, not be interpreted that we're ceding the jurisdiction to them. We could have asserted our jurisdiction because we do have jurisdiction over the matter, as does the Education and Workforce Committee. So while the chairman won't give you an advisory committee, I would assert that is my view, that this should not be interpreted as ceding the jurisdiction of the issue to that other committee.
Reclaiming my time, and at least, at the very least, let's declare it to be an open question, and let's continue to work on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Are there further amendments to the pending bill? Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print for H.R. 908 offered by Mr. Green of Texas.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this amendment to ensure that workers and employees are at the table when site security plans are developed. The goal of this legislation is to protect the public from the threat posed by dangerous facilities. This amendment would include the best qualified people in efforts to accomplish this goal. Workers have an unmatched knowledge of the facilities in which they work. The employees are the ones who are most familiar with the hazards and vulnerabilities of the facilities in which they work. They would play an integral part in detecting suspicious activity and responding to it. Employees of a facility that's a potential terrorist target would be hurt first and worst in case of an attack. They would be the last line of defense and the first affected by an attack. If employees are excluded from site security planning, vulnerabilities could be missed with catastrophic consequences. By including workers in the development of site security plans, this amendment would improve these plans and increase security. I believe it's not only a smart policy for protecting our workers, but it also makes smart business sense. And I have experience in helping manage a business for many years that the best folks who understand your business are the folks who are one producing your product out on the line. Including workers in the development of plans is just good business practice. I urge my colleagues to adopt the amendment. It should be practiced without it being in the law. In cases of a bargaining unit, it's part of their bargaining agreement, but a lot of our plants don't have bargaining agreements, and I think they should involve their employees, and particularly something that's as important as protecting a plant from attack. If there are no questions, I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment, and again, stating that my colleague from Texas has been rabidly on the back of the chairman of the subcommittee on a couple issues, this being one of them, and so I don't question his intensity and his support for not only the industry but the workers that are in the facility. So, you know, I break this debate up into two issues: the chemical vulnerability training and security site selection, and the workers response drill. It's kind of two different issues, and I probably would agree with him on the workers response drill, but the old saying is loose lips sink ships, and the security analysis is such a highly contained list, having more people know it than less raises obviously concerns of security breaches. The amendment requires owners and/or operators subject to CFATS to include at least one supervisory and one non-supervisory employee, as well as a worker representative in developing, revising, updating, or implementing a chemical facility vulnerability assessment or site security plan. This amendment raises a couple serious questions in paragraph subsection I, subsection 2 requires at least one union representative to be able to see the vulnerability assessment and the site security plan. This union representative does not actually have to work on site, which seems counterintuitive if we're trying to keep secrets contained within the plant. Moreover, existing information protections extend to persons who have passed CVI training and have a need to know. Under this amendment, it's not clear that CVI training, expertise in the area, or a need to know would be required. Even in the bill the committee reported last Congress, as well as the Democrat substitute that was made available at subcommittee, the persons participating needed to possess knowledge, experience, training, or education relevant to the portion of the security vulnerability assessment or site security plan on which the person is participating. This provision does not contain an out clause for facilities that are non-union and is taken from past bill language defining employee representatives as union representatives. Also of concern is that this amendment requires a facility, in order to have a valid security vulnerability assessment or site security plan, to involve specific workers in their developing of these documents. To date, DHS received 6,848 security vulnerability assessments and 4,136 site security plans from individual facilities. If this amendment becomes law, that almost 11,000 legally required submissions to DHS would become invalid, because these documents may never have been certified that they included specified workers. I have other issues with the amendment. I would just ask my colleagues to vote against the Green Amendment. Is there, and I yield back my...
Gentleman yield? Just briefly.
I would yield.
There are some concerns, but again, this reauthorization would only go from here forward, so I don't think there's a question about having to amend, although if they have a site security plan in some future amendment, this would be a requirement going into the future. So I don't know if we'd require my facilities to have to go back and amend just based on this. I guess it's a philosophical issue that someone's working on the plant site. If they don't have the skill and experience on security, they're the ones that ought to be contacted first and say, okay, what do we have and involved in it? And all this would do is require that. So, but I appreciate the gentleman for yielding.
My time's expired. Is anyone else seeking time on the amendment? If not, we'll call the vote on the second Green Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. And then, Pending Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. And the gentleman has requested a roll call vote. A roll call vote will be conducted after we return from votes. Is there any gentleman from California, why do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, number 18.
Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the committee print for H.R. 908 offered by Mr. Waxman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I offer this.
The amendment will be considered as read. The chair will recognize it.
I offer this amendment to ensure that this important program is actually implemented and the American public safeguarded. At the hearing on this bill, the Department of Homeland Security testified that in the 4.5 years since this program was created, not a single facility has completed the CFATS process. That means that not a single facility in this country has an approved site security plan in place. The department testified that they have repeatedly missed internal implementation deadlines and lagged behind on inspection timeliness. This failure to implement CFATS in a timely manner puts people at risk and is unacceptable. My amendment would address this problem and require that submitted site security plans be approved or disapproved in a timely manner. It would require plans to be approved or disapproved within 18 months of submission to the DHS. If we're going to rubber stamp the existing program, the least we can do as a committee is ensure that it's implemented. And I would contrast this with another bill that's moving through our committee, where an application by Shell Oil for drilling in the is it Alaska? Off the shore in Alaska has been hung up for a very long period of time, and our committee is considering putting a deadline on EPA action so that we would force them to do something rather than sit on it. 4.5 years without a single plan approved is not a good record, doesn't speak well for the way the program is being implemented. I think 18 months is enough time for them to finally make a decision, and I would add this provision to the bill, and I would hope my colleagues would accept it.
Will the gentleman yield?
Be happy to.
I actually share your concern on this issue, and I've tried to investigate it to learn what the causes might be. And so, I guess I'm exploring this with you to learn if you think what I've been told is valid. That they started from scratch in 2006. They had to hire trainers. They had to train the trainers. They had to come up with an iterative process that would work with industry, that would satisfy the provisions of the law, and that there's now 4,000 of those seeking, but the top tier is 220. I've heard they've done 4. So in yours, would they have to do all 4,000 over the next 18 months? In which case, 100 inspectors just seems inadequate.
Well, if I reclaiming my time, I just think that we need to put a deadline on them. Just let these things sit. It may have reasons for slow movement in the beginning, but if somebody's coming in and we're trying to get an approved plan for something as serious as our security, then we ought to say, let's move on it. If it takes them 18 months, then they ought to come here and ask us for the funds or decide that they've got to reform the way they operate, even more than the years it's taken them to start up. So I would submit that this is not an unreasonable thing to require the bureaucracy to get moving.
But as I do the math, if there's now, if we go all 4 tiers, there's 4,600 facilities remaining to be done. There's 100 inspectors. I could do the math in my head, but in 18 months you got X number of work days. Man, they would just be. I don't ever see a bureaucracy work like that.
Yeah, but they're not starting from scratch. A lot of these things have been pending there. They've been working on these applications that are there.
Is that true for the bottom tier? I don't know that. I'm asking. So there's, what, 4 tiers, and the 220 at the top seems to be where they've focused attention.
If they haven't been submitted, the timeline doesn't run. For those that have been submitted, that will be 18 months prospectively in which to respond. For those that will be submitted, they have 18 months. If you think 18 months is not enough time for the bureaucracy to act, do you give me an alternative period of time?
No, I was actually
leave it open-ended.
I agree.
Is troublesome, because I think we need some decisions to be made. Just as you would argue to me, I'm sure that in the Shell Oil case we needed a decision to be made.
I agree totally, if I may. And I was thinking of doing something to have 50% done within 2 years or something. And
we can look at it further, but let's set a deadline and then see what response.
I'm good with that.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes himself in opposition to the moment. Although in policy there's some agreement that we need to get folks to get these jobs done, and I think there's already been staff discussion on trying to get to language where we can agree to as we move something forward. And we could have time during the break while we're going to the floor to have staff try to. I think there are some valid concerns of an 18-month. Some should be done faster than 18 months. And some, based upon whatever mitigating factors, may go over. So if we have these new applicants and they're just right on the edge and they don't get done on 18 months in 1 day, then those would then kick back. So I do think that we have You are correct in identifying that we do push for accountability and timelines, and so we're accepting that part of this debate. Yes, I would yield.
I know we can always continue to talk about amendments, and I won't take it personally that you would oppose this amendment, but I would suggest let's do 50% in 2 years, 100% in 4 years. Let's just do something, and then we can continue to refine it. But just to oppose any deadline in the committee with the be nice and we'll continue.
Well,
to
reclaiming my time.
That's sufficient for me.
Obviously, reclaiming my time. I think I stated pretty carefully that we're willing to look at, and you raise a pretty good issue that we need to have some accountability in time. We're just saying that now let's allow the staff to work, and we're not going to cast these votes till after we come back from the floor. Maybe there's going to be some agreement that we can then add at the end of this bill. We're not disagreeing with you. 18 months may not be it. It may be 24. It may be some percentage. But let's work on that. If asked to vote on this amendment, I would ask my colleagues to vote no. But that doesn't stop the process of my sincere position that you've raised a valid point about some accountability and getting these done.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield in
I would.
a couple minutes? One of our concerns, and the reason I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, is to provide some certainty for these plants, that they know what they're, and I agree that there needs to be some kind of time frame, and being a co-sponsor of the bill that would set some time limits on, EPA responding to the shell issue in Alaska, I think is a good example that, and hopefully between now and the time we come back after a series of votes, I don't know when they'll be, but we can look at that and set Homeland Security some deadlines that says, those companies need that. And I again, representing a district, I'd like to have that certainty so they know what they're dealing with now, instead of having an application sitting over there without getting permits. But I'm encouraged by you willing to sit down and say, let's work on some language and see what we can do to push Homeland Security. They're going to have a long-term authorization, but we don't want somebody to show up 8 years from now and say, well, we still don't have a review of our site.
And reclaiming my time, I would agree with you that this does provide certainty, as we've always talked about in this process anyway, for the major facilities.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
To me?
I would.
I would like to make a unanimous consent request that we don't vote on this, but we hold it till later, and I'm open to either formulation or any other formulation between now, and we try to work out a position when we actually vote on the series of amendments that have been offered.
The Chair would ask the ranking member if at this time he is withdrawing the amendment.
No, I want us to vote on it, but not now. That we not have a vote now, and none of us vote on it now, but that this be held over for a vote, since it's going to be a roll call anyway.
Why don't we voice vote without prejudice? And that just still keeps us in the process of we're going to be calling these votes anyway. And you're looking at me like I know what I just said. That's my. Yeah, but I've been told that's the right thing to say.
Well, that's one thing to say. You could have a voice vote, or we could wait till we get a quorum enact, or and we've been very nice in not asking for a quorum. Or you could just accede to my request, which is not that big a deal. Just give me something here. It's just I get a feeling like your staff whispers in your ear, if he asks for the time of day, don't give it to him. So I make a unanimous consent request that this amendment be put over for a roll call vote when we proceed to the roll call votes, so in the hopes that we can work an amendment out. If not, we'll ask for a roll call vote on the amendment as it is.
Reserving the right to object, and I'm not sure I'm going to. Again, the concern. First of all, the ranking member knows that having served on the committee for many years, I hold him in great respect, and we've worked very hard, and we've been diligent opponents most of the time, but we still have great camaraderie. So my objections are always policy, not personal. And having said that, I would then ask if there is an objection to the ranking member's unanimous consent request. Hearing none, the ranking member has won one. Is there any other amendments? The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have an amendment at the desk. It's number 5.
Will the clerk report the amendment?
Amendment offered by Mrs. Katz.
Gentlelady is the amendment is open and considered as read. The chair recognizes the gentlelady for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I won't take 5 minutes because this amendment has just the one word in it, switching a may to a shall. And I offer this amendment because it closes a glaring security gap. For some reason, when this section was created by the Appropriations Committee, the Secretary of Homeland Security was given discretion to approve plans. In other words, given the option to approve or disapprove plans that fail to meet risk-based security standards. To me, this is an oxymoron. It's simply unacceptable. The department has spent years developing risk-based standards to ensure our security. They've spent years evaluating the risk to facilities across the country. These facilities must address those risks and meet those standards. This amendment would ensure that the standards are met by requiring the Secretary to disapprove plans that fall short. In other words, takes the discretion away from the Secretary's ability to, to decide one way or the other on something that the department has deemed to be essential for security in these facilities across the country. Surely our national security is too important to leave this to discretion, to the discretion of one person, and to allow the approval of site security plans that do not meet these risk-based standards that have taken years to develop, that have been developed by a team. And so I don't think I need to spend any more time explaining it, just to make sure that when the professional work has been done to determine the risk-based standards in order that the security of this country be met around the facilities, that we make sure that those plans are put into place rather than giving a loophole or an opt-out to the Secretary. And so I urge my colleagues to support this vital amendment, which just changes one word in the bill. Thank you very much, and I will yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back her time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. And politics and public policy sometimes make strange bedfellows. I now rise in support of the administration, which I don't do that often, because the Department of Homeland Security really wants this discretion. They want the ability to be able to work with facilities and correct things without, and that's what they've asked. We think that they are well intended to do all they can and help protect the safety of the people in and around the chemical facilities. So in that respect, I'm going to side with the administration.
And would the gentleman yield when you're finished?
I'd be happy to yield.
Because in this case, and maybe this is a difference, especially given the majority at present, that I want to exercise that the Congress of the United States has an obligation as well to contain the responsibility of the administration, if you will, if you want to put it that way, when it comes to the safety of our constituents, of the citizens of this country, and that we evaluate that we give authority to a department to spend years to develop standards. And those standards should not be subject to political whim or whatever it is that you think is going to be inserted here. And I know you didn't mean political in that sense of the word, but when you want to do it that way, to me, it smacks of playing politics with something that should be above politics in what we do in terms of the safety of the communities that we represent. And I know this is tough because there's a lot of pressure that could come from some of these facilities.
If the gentlelady, we're claiming on my time.
All right.
I want to support the executive branch request that they have the flexibility to imply that it's industry manipulation of the executive branch that would invade their decision making on the security of their citizens. I reject that premise. I mean, that's what they're paid for. They run the everyday operations. They're professionals, and I would just hope we would debate this on the merits and not on implied.
Could I just ask, Mr. Chairman? I know that your time has run out. Could I just make the question to you? What if these standards fail? What if these plans have failed to meet the standards? What if these plants in their facilities? Isn't that a fairly black and white issue?
My time's expired. If I'd ask unanimous consent for 1 minute to respond, is there objection? No objection. I find myself in a curious position of supporting the administration and Homeland Security, who wants the discretion, and that's what I'm going to side with in this case. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Waxman.
I'll not take my full time. I just want to say that the compromises that we can reach can be achieved by just thinking together without saying that everything has to be worked out later by staff. We can think it through. How could we say that the Secretary how can we not say the Secretary shall disapprove a plan that doesn't work? I mean, to say that the Secretary has the authority to do it may. We don't want them to ignore their authority. We want them to use their authority, because ultimately this is the protection of the people from a terrorist attack. So we want them to act. We want them to do something. We want them to do it in a timely manner. And if the plan's not adequate, we want them to say no. Why is it suddenly you have such great faith in the bureaucracy that you're letting them use their discretion? Put some parameters on the bureaucracy. That always made a lot of sense to me when I heard it from Democrats and Republicans.
Yep.
So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Yield to Mr. Green.
I'd like to thank our ranking member for yielding. I agree the amendment. I like to have a process, and we don't have jurisdiction over the Department of Interior, but I'm really familiar with their process on permitting. They have a permit time that they don't deem the application is complete. Our complaint is that they have hundreds of permits sitting there that they haven't deemed complete, and it's hard to get information back from them. I don't want Homeland Security to put my plants in the same situation where they're continuing trying to get some certainty in that permit, and it's a ping pong back and forth because the agency's not being responsive. And maybe if it's not part of this bill, maybe we need to have an oversight hearing on our jurisdiction on this and say, I want to know why you haven't issued a permit in 4 years. I mean, I have facilities that have been in our district for 60 years, or longer than that. Some of them are celebrating their 100th anniversary. That, they need that certainty of the permit, and maybe we need to look at that. And even if it's a joint hearing between us and Homeland Security, once we deal with this bill, we ought to find out why isn't Homeland Security not doing that. I guess I'm fortunate. I have a district that our state legislature, with the approval of both our government agencies and our industry, created a port security district. They taxed themselves to come up with funds to bring down federal money because of the volatility and we're still tier 1 in threat. And we have a good working relationship together, but we still need that certainty with Homeland Security.
Gentlemen,
I'm glad. Thank you, gentlemen, for
I want to just reclaim my time. You know what it sounds like to me? That if an industry needed the government to act, this committee is very anxious to assure that there's action. But if the industry doesn't care because the status quo means that they can just do whatever they're doing, then they don't care if it ever acts or not. Well, that doesn't make sense. It sounds to me that the only time we get attention to this committee is when an industry is asking for something. But there's no industry that's going to say to the members of this committee what the public believes that we're supposed to be doing, and that's to protect them from the consequences of a terrorist attack. So I would urge you to look at it from this different perspective. I want to yield to my colleague from California. Don't you think that government bureaucracy ought to be forced to act rather than, let's say, sit in limbo?
You know,
whatever it is.
I would say the action, though, as somebody who has done oversight with the private sector, the action should be working with the private sector so that we're not killing the foundation of everything that makes those of us in government possible, and that is the private sector, the economic prosperity. There's a way of doing it. And I've run into that. The difference between my environmental health department and my air district, I had an environmental health department that worked with industry, worked with the community, worked with the private sector to get an outcome. I had another department head who was just punitive and it just came down. And the fact is the two agencies that were protecting the public with a totally different mindset. You can protect jobs and the health at the same time. But if your attitude is, I don't care, or my priority isn't to protect the jobs. I only worry about this department. Not only is not the environment, the job issue going thing, but the protections.
I agree with you, but let's don't assume that this is that attitude. We want government to operate by talking to the private sector, working it out, but acting, and that's why I support this amendment.
Time's expired.
Chairman.
Chair recognizes gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I yield to Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you. How many times have you been to, even in the military, is when the IG comes to inspect a unit, they say, "I'm from the IG, I'm here to help you." So the issue, this is the debate of whether government is helpful and helping industry move in the direction that we want it to, or it's just viewed as punitive. This debate is not disassociated from the debate about jobs. You know, if you don't have employers, you don't have employees. It's a known. I'll yield him. If you don't have employers, you don't have employees. And if we continue to raise the bar to a point where these individuals manufacture, produce chemical operations overseas, which is a real risk, you know, that community will be a lot safer, I granted you, but they'll be unemployed. So to disassociate this debate with what the industry has to do, and I quoted in one of the opening statements, one industry, $8 billion of capital that has to be raised to make the changes to comply with CFATs? That's $8 billion. That's $8 billion more than an association would have to do in Southeast Asia. That's $8 billion more that an industry would have to do in South America. And so where is the cost of goods in that relationship when we're already in a position of having a challenge based upon environmental regs, which they don't comply with, and OSHA and all those other rules and regs? This amendment assumes that for all these, there's a one-size-fits-all, and that's not necessarily true. And that's why we want the Department of Homeland Security to say, we're here for the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to inspect you on CFAT. We want you to have a secure facility, and we're here to help you obtain those goals. And I know my colleague from Louisiana is requesting time, so I will yield to him.
I reject that this is actually going to make things safer. In fact, in my interchange with Mr. Markey, I never got the clear answer. If we have a checklist of 1 to 100, and 1 is very important that they've got to fulfill, and 100 is kind of best practices but not important, come back and we expect to have it done within a year, but this is really not going to make or break it. Under your amendment, as far as I can tell, the whole plan is thrown out. Now, there is a restriction of resources. There's 100 inspectors to do 200 Tier 1, 220 or something like that, and 4,000 chemical facilities in general. Under yours, there's just going to be this constant sort of, oh my gosh, you didn't hit best practices 100 criteria, so therefore we have to come inspect you, and we have limited ability to actually complete the others. Now, I actually think that the people in Homeland Security are smart people who actually are good Americans, who are patriotic, who actually want to protect us against a terrorist attack. I don't think you're giving them the same credit. If they can't have some discretion to say, as they do under the current laws, I gather, listen, 1 through 99 are very important, but 100 is best practices, and we'll come back to you
with the gentleman
in just a second.
Sure.
Then I just don't think we're giving them the capability. I'll say lastly, you know, I came to Congress 3 years ago. I had to live under laws passed by this Congress and others, not the 112th but previous, and sometimes there'd be no common sense. And you'd ask the person checking the box, why in the heck are we doing this? And they would say, well, it's in the law. I'm thinking, I am trying to see uninsured patients having to waste my time on this piece of paper because someone in Congress said that there wasn't anybody smart enough on the front line to do it correctly. This actually, no offense, kind of reminds me of that. It's not my time to yield, but I yield back to the
chair. The gentleman yields back to the chair, and the chair now will yield to the gentlelady from
Thank
California.
you. I was going to appeal to my colleague. I know your background as a physician, and just say, you know, if the hospital team that sets the quality standards for the operating room sets these standards, shouldn't the operating room shouldn't those be approved?
May I respond to this?
At the discretion, so that you can do your surgery?
May I respond to this?
Would the gentlelady yield back to me, and I'll
Sure,
yield to the gentleman from Louisiana.
When a hospital is certified, they come and they go through, and if there is a major problem, they will decertify the hospital. You
And
can't
that's
get Medicaid.
exactly what we're talking about.
On the other hand, if there is a minor little glitch, they will say the hospital will not lose its ability to bill Medicaid and Medicare. Rather, the minor glitch is fixed. That is common sense. This is not.
My time has expired. I just want to let people know that they're getting close to the point of calling votes on the floor. We'd like to at least make sure we have a vote on this and any others before we have to come back. I'm assuming this is the last one. It may be a bad assumption. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is the last amendment, and it's just remarkable to me that rather than find a problem, if you find a problem and you cannot correct it, you act on it. Not if you feel like it, you may act on it. I wouldn't want, I would, just taking the hospital analogy, I wouldn't want the people that run the hospital, if they see a dangerous situation, to have the discretion to ignore it. And if you have some distrust of bureaucracy, and I have a lot of distrust of bureaucracy, I don't want to give them that much latitude. I want them, at some point, to say, this isn't right. This is a dangerous facility. We're not going to allow this to continue.
Will the gentleman yield?
Not yet. So I want them to act, and I want them to act within a certain period of time. It doesn't force them to act. It says that they, except when they find this problem. And they still have ways of operating without closing somebody down or not working with the private sector and all of that. I think you leave them in a situation where they can be in a state of inertia forever. And if that's the case, what do we need this program to start with? Yield to you.
Yeah, if JCAH finds a hospital with a dangerous situation, they will close it down. But I promise you, any hospital you've been treated in has most likely had a citation. Now, the hospital is still approved, but there is going to be a citation. Now, if we're going to say, wait a second, if any hospital has any problem, you're not going to be able to be approved, no one's going to get health care. Similarly in this.
Well, let me reclaim my time, because there is no checklist, but the Department of Homeland Security determines whether a facility is so risky that it exceeds the risk-based standard. If there's a minor glitch, that could only trigger a disapproval if it resulted in the facility being too risky to terrorist attack. That's the standard. So
if that's the standard, why are we changing it? I mean, right now they may disapprove, and if they find that I'm sorry, will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, certainly.
If there is a problem, as I gather under current law, they may disapprove. and yet for some reason we are not.
But I want
trusting.
them to disapprove. I don't want them to have that much discretion. If they think that this is the situation, then I don't want them to sit on it forever. I want them to act. And the amendment says they shall enforce the law. That doesn't mean, if I look at this amendment, it says that it's amended by striking may disapprove to say they shall disapprove. So they shall act. They don't have to take the ultimate penalty, but they can do something. They can give a warning, and if it gets to the point where it meets this standard, that it's too risky to a terrorist attack, I don't want them to sit on that and not act because they've got a lot of other applications, and they got a letter from a congressman saying don't act too quickly and things like that. So this is the difference we have. It's not a big one, except in the real world. And if you want to trust a bureaucracy to act or not act when the industry doesn't care, that's fine. But when the industry cares, you certainly want them to act, and you want them to act quickly. And I think it ought to go both ways because the purpose of acting or inacting is for the public, not for the industry. So if you have to yield further, otherwise we can take the vote on the last issue before us, and I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Green.
I agree with what Mr. Cassidy said, but if we have an agency that's 4 years been doing this and they haven't issued a permit, somewhere along the way there needs to be a very good checklist. And I know dealing with it with our industries, you have a fencing issue, you have a monitored security, you have a video, real-time video, and there are things to be done. I don't think this amendment precludes working with someone to say these are your checklists, and if you don't do them, you're not going to have this permit to continue to operate. But I think
But the gentleman yield, because it's not clear to me that that is the case. It is not clear to me from the amendment that what I'm hearing is that the intent is not to provide latitude, not to provide discretion.
Well, I think maybe the current law provides way too much discretion because if it's been 4 years and they haven't issued a permit, and that's what you said, and I verified it, somewhere along the way. Now, I know a growth pattern because I have some very large plants that they've always had fencing. Now, that's why my other amendment, the folks know who actually have to work out there say, oh, I can sneak through that fence. They need to deal with that. But Homeland Security needs to do it. I have to admit, there are great people in Homeland Security, but I've had constituents complain now for over a year on personal pat-downs. I had my first one at Intercontinental Airport in Houston, and the next time he does it, he's going to at least have to buy me dinner. So the Homeland Security may not be so perfect as we think they are. They need oversight from the board of directors, and that's what this Congress is. Thank you for yielding.
If I can reclaim my time for the last time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Anyone else seeking time on the amendment? If not, the vote will be conducted on the CAPS amendment. All those in favor say. Look, it's going to be roll called anyway. Let's just voice it, and then all morning we've been voicing, and then we're going to come back and have a roll call vote on it. So you will be. Yeah, it's the agreement with the ranking member. All those in favor of the CAPS amendment say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. Independent chair, the noes have it. And as per the agreement, the vote will be cast on return after the vote's on the floor. Are there any other amendments? Having no other amendments, the chair recesses the mark up until 10 minutes after the last vote on the floor.
Committee is going to come to order. When the committee recessed, we had completed debate on amendments to H.R. 908, the full implementation of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, and by agreement, we will now proceed to a series of roll call votes that were ordered on 7 different amendments. First up is the substitute offered by Mr. Waxman, which we considered as the First Amendment, and the clerk will call the roll on the Waxman amendment.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Is Mr. Rogers up there? Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Mr. Upton.
Votes no. Other members wishing to cast their votes? Mr.
Upton,
Whitfield?
nay. Mr. Whitfield, nay.
Dr. Burgess?
Dr. Burgess, nay.
How is Mr. Terry recorded?
Mr. Terry's recorded aye. Mr. Terry off aye on nay.
Mr. Butterfield?
Mr. Butterfield, aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Waxman?
Mr. Waxman, aye.
Are there other members? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Oh. How is Mr. Stearns recorded?
The gentleman is not recorded.
And
Mr. Stearns, nay.
And how is Mr. Murphy recorded?
The gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Murphy, nay.
Clerk report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, 18 aye, 26 nay.
18 aye, 26 nay. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. Next up is a Markey amendment on disapproval of site security plans. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, nay. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, nay. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, nay. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, nay. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Mr. Upton.
Votes no.
Mr. Upton, nay.
Are there other members wishing to cast their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report. Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Dingle, aye.
No other members seeking to vote. The clerk will report the tally. Oh, wait. Mr. Whitfield, are you recorded?
Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
On that, there were 16 ayes, 30 nays.
16 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. We now move to the Green second-degree amendment to the Shimkus amendment on the length of the authorization period. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton? No. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts? Mrs. Bono-Mack? Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bass? Mr. Bass, no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers? Mrs. McMorris-Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson? Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman?
Aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, nay. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. The gentleman is recorded nay. Mr. Ross, off nay on aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Olson, how are you recorded?
Gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Olson, nay.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that there were 21 ayes, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. So the question now occurs on the Shimkus amendment for an authorization of 7 years. All those in favor say aye. Aye. You want a roll call vote?
Well, these are all roll call votes.
Well, there was an amendment. Those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, nay. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, nay. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, nay. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, nay. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, nay. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, nay. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, nay. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, nay. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, nay. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, nay. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, nay. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, nay. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, nay. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, nay. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, nay. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, nay. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, nay. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, nay. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, nay. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, nay. Ms. Christensen. Mr. Upton.
Votes aye.
Mr. Upton, aye.
Other member, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Whitfield, aye.
There are other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. I think that's the accompanying band for Mr. Markey. They're auditioning. Clerk will report the tally.
On that, there were 27 ayes, 21 nays.
27 ayes, 21 nays. The amendment is agreed to. Next vote is on the Green Amendment dealing with employee participation. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack, nay. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Mr. Upton.
Votes no.
Mr. Upton, nay.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that there were 21 ayes, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next vote is on the Waxman Amendment on deadlines for approval of site security plans. And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack, nay. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen? Mr. Upton?
Votes no.
Mr. Upton, nay.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Chairman, on that, there were 21 ayes, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The last amendment vote occurs on the CAPS amendment dealing with disapproval of site security plans. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton? No. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts? Mrs. Bono-Mack? Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bass? Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers? Mrs. McMorris-Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, nay.
Are there other members wishing to cast their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 21 ayes, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No. Roll call.
The roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Aye. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Stearns.
That's it.
Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, nay. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, nay. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, nay. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, nay. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, nay. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, nay. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, nay. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, nay. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, nay. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, nay. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, nay. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, nay. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, nay. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, nay. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, nay. Ms. Christensen. Mr. Upton.
Votes aye.
Mr. Upton.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Walden.
Could I inquire as to how I'm recorded?
The gentleman is recorded aye.
Thank you.
Ms. Bono-Mack.
The gentlelady is recorded aye.
Mr. Murphy.
Could you ask, what bill was this?
The clerk, are there other members wishing to cast a vote?
We're trying to get somebody here.
Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Mr. Rogers.
How was I recorded?
As some would say, the good Mr. Rogers. How is Mr. Rogers?
The gentleman is not recorded.
The gentleman wants to be recorded as aye, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rogers, aye.
Then I will be too, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
On that, there are 33 ayes, 16 nays.
33 ayes, 16 nays. The bill is favorably reported and
Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill as passed. So ordered. Chair would recognize Mr. Waxman.
I want to assert our privileges and rights to file minority reports.
Without
In the
objection.
appropriate number of days.
Without objection. Chair thanks all members and staff, wishes them a good holiday weekend. Committee stands adjourned.